I'm really pleased to welcome everyone joining here today to a timely series of conversations supporting the UN's Decade of Action. Our world is confronted with a global crisis unlike any other. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken hundreds of thousands of lives, affected billions of people, and risks eroding decades of development progress. The pandemic has highlighted the fragilities of today's world. But even before the crisis hit, it was clear that we were not on track to implement the Sustainable Development Goals by the target date of 2030. The Decade of Action on the SDGs was launched in January of this year with the aim of accelerating progress and turning aspirations into activation. As the pandemic continues to wreak havoc on societies and economies, the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement are the blueprints for a strong, successful recovery. But we can only deliver on them with the rapid, unified, collective contributions of all: governments, private sector, civil society, academia, and more. We need to find innovative ways of bringing these stakeholders together and maximizing their joint potential. I therefore welcome the development of SustainChain by the US Coalition on Sustainability and the Blue Chip Foundation. SustainChain is a technology platform designed to match and support peer-to-peer collaboration on sustainability goals and challenges. It aims to empower sustainability changemakers, unify efforts, and bring together the collective power of sustainability practitioners, innovators, and social investors. We know that systems-based change enabled by the best technology has to offer as a pathway to reaching the level and pace of change that is needed to secure our future. That's why technologies like SustainChain are so exciting to hear about.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us in the third in this three-part series brought to us by the US Coalition on Sustainability. We are talking this week about accelerating change toward the Sustainable Development Goals using the new SustainChain platform, as Amina Mohammed just talked to us about. This week, we brought together some of the world's premier thought leaders, innovators, and visionaries who are committed to accelerating progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm excited to continue that in this last and final talk on this program. So I come to these discussions as an ambassador in the fashion industry to the US Coalition on Sustainability. And I've been helping explore ways that we can use SustainChain to speed up positive progress in my industry. I was blown away when I first encountered this software, and I encourage you all to log on and check it out after this talk, obviously. There's nothing else like it for connecting brands and innovators with capital. I actually couldn't believe it didn't already exist. So I want to address the fact that we are at UN General Assembly Week, and we're talking about impact and meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, but we're hosting a panel dedicated to fashion. One thing I want to do is explain a little bit about SustainChain. I describe it to people almost like LinkedIn and Crunchbase had a sustainability baby. It allows innovators and brands to connect with finance with speed and fluidity. In the last two panels, we have heard that these kind of connections typically take years. Gabriella Hearst said that if SustainChain had existed, things that took her business 5 years to achieve could have taken 5 minutes. But we don't have years. We need solutions, brands, and scaling capital to find each other now. As we were iterating the thinking on how SustainChain could be the most successful in its objective to provide the ability to companies across industries to simultaneously rebuild their supply chains by 2030, We quickly realized and began to get echoed by companies like Patagonia that bringing NGOs to the platform would be key to branching out and creating far and wide change. It is these NGOs who we're going to talk to today who've been working on the ground to identify solutions in the fashion supply chain, and they became a top priority on the SustainChain roadmap. So now we have the opportunity on this platform to supercharge these collective actions that they have already brought to light and build toward these initiatives with pace and the transparency of technology. The reason we're talking about fashion is that fashion is the Trojan horse of impact. Fashion has all of the nasty problems of plastics or batteries or big agriculture. It's just wrapped up in a prettier picture. The production and distribution of clothing is responsible for dirty water, greenhouse gas, forced labor, waste, microplastics, and so much more. And there is an addressable market here. Last year, the size of the apparel market just in the United States was estimated to be approximately $368 billion US. The textile sector still represents 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and that is rising, and 10 to 20% of pesticide use. Washing, solvents, and dyes used in manufacturing are responsible for 1/5 of industrial water pollution, and clothing accounts to 20 to 30% of microplastics flowing into the ocean. At the beginning of the global pandemic, the fashion supply chain all but shut down, exposing its fragility. And in truth, any of us working on this supply chain realized that it had been broken for a long time, but people were still making money. But when production lines, farms, mills, and retailers all but shut down, the money stopped flowing, and we have an industry waking up to its need for radical change. Fashion has remained largely unchanged for the last 150 years, which makes it ripe for systemic disruption. And that's why I'm so excited to have this conversation today. I cannot imagine a better group of people to speak about progress toward change and what the fashion future state can look like if we dramatically increase our change and awareness. Our guests today are the NGOs and policy architects working to re-architect the fashion supply chain and build it back in a better, cleaner, and more equitable way. They also represent the radical collaboration necessary to move fashion into an era of connected action. I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves and tell us the roles that their organizations play in the fashion industry. Amina, could you go first?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Carrie. First of all, I want to say it's a pleasure to be here and to be on this incredible panel talking about a very timely and necessary topic. And what you said in the introduction and also what Amina Mohammed said just really resonates. And I think we all agree on what the pandemic has shed light on in terms of the industry and the real need for change. It's been a huge wake-up call, and it will take all of us really working together to solve systemic problems. For those who may be less familiar with the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition is a global organization that was started 10 years ago by two really unlikely organizations, Walmart and Patagonia, as you mentioned. And really the goal was to bring their partners across the value chain together to create standardized tools to measure social and environmental performance. And really there was a recognition that if everyone was looking at how they measured social and environmental performance or looking at sustainability in different ways, we were not going to be able to drive the kind of collective change or the kind of improvement and performance improvement that the industry really needed. So 10 years ago, we started on this path to develop tools that actually measure social and environmental performance across the value chain, which is called the Higg Index. And it's actually a set of 5 tools that look at everything from the materials that go into products to how those products are produced to the brands and retailers that make those products and the facilities that are making them within the supply chain. We now have over 250 members across the entire globe, and we span every part of the value chain, from brands, retailers, manufacturers, to governments, NGOs, and service providers. We just held our 10th annual meeting this week. It just wrapped up yesterday, and we had more than 870 participants really engaging on this work. And so it's wonderful to see how much the SAC has grown within the past 10 years. And we're excited to talk about how we're working together, not with just the partners here, but how we can work together with others to really advance this work collectively.
Great, Larea, can you tell us about the Textile Exchange?
Sure. Well, the Textile Exchange began as the Organic Exchange almost 20 years ago. So we have had a focused work plan in fibers and materials themselves. So much like the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, we are global in action and have about 420 plus members from that entire supply network as well. But we take that deeper dive around fibers and materials specifically to put them along a continuum of what is preferred and how do we move along that threshold from actually doing less harm to actually doing positive things when it comes to the environment and biodegradability, biodiversity, regenerative agricultural practices. And so it's really in that area that we focus. We have a suite of standards like responsible wool, responsible down, in order to not only put that preferred direction of travel out there, but to actually measure progress and continuous improvement. And so the verbs in our mission are to inspire and equip. So it is about taking the brands and the retailers and the people in the supply network and telling their story about the positive changes they're making and equipping them to make greater change. So we're excited to be here as well. And we'll talk more about the partnerships we have with the group on board. So great to be here.
Looking forward to that. Brittany from Fashion for Good, can you tell us about what you guys are doing?
Sure. So it's the end of the day here in Amsterdam, and my internet has decided I think it's reached capacity. So if I drop off at any point, I'll join you guys via my cell phone. But so I'm Brittany. I'm the Director of Strategy at Fashion for Good. So we are a global innovation platform connecting sustainable innovators and the industry in order to drive commercial adoption. So what this means, kind of put simply, is we effectively act as outsourced research and development for our 20 corporate partners, bridging them with the most promising startups, which we call innovators, in order to truly scale. So we believe innovation is one of the critical levers required to actually drive the industry forward. And we look at startups across the value chain. So raw materials, new processing techniques, circular business models, packaging, traceability, you name it. And we'll get into some of those later in the session, but yeah, thanks for having us.
Great, and last but not least, Lewis Perkins from the Apparel Impact Institute.
Thank you, Carrie. I also want to echo everyone by saying how great it is to be here, not only presenting to the audience that's watching, but also with this particular panel, because these are three individuals that I'm working very closely with in a lot of different capacities. And so it's wonderful to have an opportunity for us to talk about ourselves individually, but I think the concept of collective action, alignment, and partnership is going to come up a lot in this discussion, because that's kind of key to what we do at the Apparel Impact Institute. So I'm Lewis Perkins, and I do run the Apparel Impact Institute, and we were founded by a group of brand manufacturers who were part of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition to scale impact. And so if you look at the tools that the SAC is elevating to the industry and scaling within the industry, you have an opportunity for a lot of data collection that is happening. And that data provides deep insights into where the problems exist within the supply chain or design, manufacturing, materials, et cetera. So AII was founded to identify the key areas that would be necessary, or the hot spots that we would drive impact, to fund those programs by looking at unique and creative funding mechanisms or blended capital, whether it's philanthropy or corporate treasury dollars from sustainability budgets, and obviously bringing in the financial institutions to look at concessionary finance, et cetera, and then scale and measure those solutions. And so I know I'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that. We're very much, I think, in alignment with how Brittany also described Fashion for Good in a way that they're really looking at really key disruptions and innovations to accelerate. And I think there's a really nice way in which we're looking at sort of the programmatic piece and how the two organizations also fit too. So I know we'll talk more about that.
We have so much to talk about.
Yes.
With each of you, I think I would like to focus quickly on, we've brought you now all onto SustainChain. And one of the things that has been happening within the industry is that you have all been working in your organizations to do incredible things. And in the last year, you have all come together to start doing some of those things in a more connected way together. So what I want to talk about are some of the individual things that you your organizations are doing. And then we'll talk a little bit more about some exciting things that are coming up and the ways that we want to amplify them. So Larea, I'd love to start with you. The Textile Exchange is the keeper of a lot of the industry's collective action around preferred fibers, standards, certifications. You guys are really doing the work, and the holders of those initiatives like 2025 Sustainable Cotton Challenge comes to mind for me. And your team's currently rolling up their sleeves to get those things up into SustainChain, which would hit a wider audience than just the Textile Exchange, which is already quite large, but this hits more of a global audience. So I'm wondering, using technology in this way, what kind of progress does that represent for you in reaching your missions? You and I had a conversation, and I loved this. You talked about taking those collective actions and turning them into connected actions. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how this can help.
Absolutely. And I just have to share that as we talk about SustainChain and the potential that is there, we know we have solutions, but it's time to scale those solutions and drive them to adoption. And someone was talking about the program and, like you say, getting everything into the system. And it's like, I think this is going to create a chain reaction. And so it is about the exponential good that we're able to do when we go from just islands of good through collective action to a force for change with connected action. The 2025 Sustainable Cotton Challenge is a perfect example to talk about how all the different cotton initiatives, for example, Better Cotton Initiative, U.S. Cotton Trust Protocol, Cotton Made in Africa, the My Better Best Practices in Australia, 11 different initiatives getting together. So think about what happens when in a few weeks they're going to announce, we're all going to address soil together. That, looking at taking synthetic fertilizers out of the cotton system and really having a positive impact on greenhouse gases when you join together 114 brands. Some of those are like IKEA, Levi, Nikes, Inditex. When you hit the heavy hitters that are using a lot of cotton, and they make the commitment to these sustainable cotton initiatives, and they're all committing to healthy soils, then you're going to get the exponential good of that connected action. So it's very exciting to see these challenges and the willingness. I think the spirit is finally here that it's time to accelerate, and the spirit is there and the mindset is there to truly collaborate. So it's very exciting times.
Yeah, it's sort of like Amina Mohammed was saying in her introduction, we already weren't getting fast enough toward the goals before we decided on a decade of action. And now we can't do it if we're not connected. One note is that Larea Pepper is actually one of the preeminent organic cotton farmers. There's nothing that Larea does not know about organic cotton and regenerative agriculture. She's an incredible resource that way.
Thanks. My blood for sure.
Louis, I want to talk to you a little bit about Apparel Impact Institute and how to taking what you do, which is so deep in the supply chain. You're really working on what inside baseball we call scope 3, but really at the mill level, and the environmental effects of creating the types and amount of textiles that the world uses. And when we first showed you SustainChain and what it was built to do, you got pretty excited because you're working on these reduction programs, and to scale them takes will and it takes capital. So how do you see the role of something like that helping what the Apparel Impact Institute is doing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and Carrie, thanks for kind of teeing up the what we do piece. We help identify the programming, as I mentioned earlier, and oftentimes we'll play a role in running that programming. And so, but we do it through a network of partnerships. So looking at other organizations that are in the supply chain working on resource efficiency, water efficiency savings, carbon reductions, energy, chemistry, et cetera. And so we're sort of a network of players within that. So you're right. One of our core key programs that we are scaling is called Clean by Design, and it's in partnership with a number of mill improvement programs and networks that are out there globally. This program was started by Dr. Linda Greer at the NRDC, and it went through its pre-seed and pilot development to about 100 different facilities in China over the last 8 years. And now we're at a position where we can introduce to the brands that are working with us this sort of Forrester recruitment to bring these programs into the mills. And one of the things that I think is needed and necessary is the ability to network and activate a lot of the facilities. And so through our partnership with SAC, through some of the other partnerships with ZDHC, we're able to reach into the supply chains and manufacturers to bring these programs in. But oftentimes the question will be, how do you pay for this? And so there's two parts to a lot of these disruptions. And it's the same if we're talking about going in and doing resource efficiency, or we're scaling renewables. So it could be, lowering carbon is also around renewable energy increases, and that's a big role, not just in the mill function, where a lot of the energy intensive coal burning processes, but also in the garment cut and sew stage, what we call tier 1. And so as we're looking at scaling programs, we need investment. And so to cut to the chase to your question is platforms that are going to enable us to get a little outside of our own bubble, because I think we very much live in our world, sustainable apparel, sustainable textile, footwear, where we're kind of talking to a lot of the same players. And we're grateful for those players because they've been funding a lot of this work. But I think one of the key areas we need to be able to bring opportunity to is, how does a facility who's established a science-based target finance that? And then what programs do they need that can come in and actually give them their roadmap on, these are the investments that will be necessary. This is where you'll have a return on that investment. And this is where you may need to take a longer term approach. So being able to do that financial analysis and be able to bring those key partners to the table is something that we've been doing in sort of I'd say an ad hoc approach. And now the level of coordination with the financial community, from government grant to philanthropic, family office, banks, venture capital, is going to need to increase. And I know that's something that Brittany and her team at Fashion for Good have also put out a really great white paper on the financing of this kind of work and bringing the investment community to it.
Well,
So I'm plugging her work too.
I know. Well, I think that there is an amazing white paper that if you are interested in this area, you should absolutely read, that Fashion for Good has put out about what it's going to take to finance and scale those innovations. So Brittany, maybe you've just been teed up by Lewis. So can we talk about Fashion for Good has over 100 innovations that you have looked at in pilot phase that are on your website, and they're about to go live on SustainChain. And yesterday we talked with Stacey Flynn from Evernew, who's an innovator, and about the crucial need for capital and brand commitments for these innovations to get from pilot to scale. You have to have the demand from brands for capital to be interested in you, and you have to be able to fund and promise that you will be able to deliver for those brands. It's kind of a chicken and egg situation. What kind of progress and speed do you think we can expect when they're all in this very intentional ecosystem in SustainChain?
Yeah, so I think perhaps to start with a bit of context that's really helpful. So we map all of those 100 plus innovators and the 2,500 that we've looked at over the past 3 years. We map them using TRLs, or technical readiness levels. This is a framework that we borrowed from NASA. Perhaps a spacesuit is fashionable. We could make that argument, but the framework is on a scale of 1 to 9, with 1 being the idea phase and 9 being commercially available. And what we do at Fashion for Good is we focus our work on the innovators in that 4 to 5 space with a working proof of concept, that by pairing them, exactly like you said, with those industry players, whether it's brands, manufacturers, and funders, we can move them further up the scale to that 7 or 8 range. So systems like SustainChain can enable those connections required to advance those innovators technically and commercially, and then ultimately shift the industry. So it's quite complementary, of course.
We're very excited about that. This SAC does something really exciting and necessary that we don't really yet have in fashion. It can be hard for brands to judge their progress and for customers to understand what they're really getting. And you've created a measurement tool called HIG that is sort of a way to compare apples to apples. And I just wonder how you envision one of the big things that has happened for you guys is a partnership with Zalando, that Zalando has said all of the brands that sell on there in the next few years must use the Higg Index as their measurement tool, which means that you're already getting outside of what Lewis referred to as the sustainable textile bubble. You're kind of going wide, and then which is already an amplification. So how do you think this can help further amplify as you get into SustainChain? And do you see a way in which the Higg Index could help create interesting cross-reference and progress?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, most people realize that you really can't manage what you don't measure. Right. And so for us, collective action really starts with standardized measurement. And that's why the Higg Index was created. And that's actually why the SAC was created 10 years ago. Because if every company, brands, retailers, and manufacturers are all looking at things in different ways or measuring different aspects of sustainability or sustainability performance, it's really hard to drive collective action together. And so for us, it all starts with getting companies to look at things, as you say, and measuring apples to apples. So when we then move into collective action, we all have a common reference point, right? Where the Higg Index, which is the set of tools that's developed by the industry for the industry, can look at these tools and can look at the outputs and say, okay, well, now where do we need to, both as companies individually, but also either as a coalition or as an industry, where do we really need to focus our efforts? And you can only do that if you're all looking at the same data and leveraging those insights and those hotspots, as Lewis has mentioned as well. Looking at all of that collectively and saying, okay, now where do we need to focus? Where do we need to bring innovation, fill those gaps, bring investment to bear? So I think all of that is really critical, and it all starts with standardized measurement. In terms of SustainChain, I think then that's this next level, right? Where you have practitioners, you have innovators, you have investment. And I see there being an opportunity to then connect the dots. So once brands and retailers have been able to actually measure their performance and figure out where they need to focus their efforts, where are their risks, where are the gaps, that's where I think it can really start to connect into, well, who else is already in that space? What are they doing? How do you connect investment to really help a company improve their performance individually, and then ultimately help the industry improve its performance overall?
It's really exciting. As I said, fashion does not have another. Oh my God, I'm sorry. Fashion does not have another measurement tool, and this is really exciting. Just a note to the audience: I'm going to start asking the panelists some general questions, and if you would like to ask them a question, please put it in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can before we're up. So I want to focus now on you guys are talking about all the things that you are doing separately, but you're doing something really exciting that you've come together recently to do, which is a roadmap for impact reduction across the industry. It's a huge undertaking, and I'd love for any of you to comment on it. Maybe Lorraine, can you get us started?
Sure. The roadmap is really important because if you don't have a clear destination in mind, then you're not going to get there. And so I think having this a direction of travel that we need to know we don't have all the answers. There's still some data that we're collecting, but we have a general direction of travel, and that is in the direction of lower energy use, living within the planetary boundaries, clean water, preferred materials, responsible materials, organic and regenerative are the direction of travel. And we're not going to wait till it's perfect to figure it out. But this roadmap lets us all know the direction we're going and to leverage our respective strengths in order to lend energy and time to get there. So I think having a common agreement on what those priorities are and laying it out there for the industry to say, here's where we're going, come along, and is going to be really important to hit. This is the decade of change. And so it's time, while we need to continue to experiment, it's time to deliver on the proven solutions we have and scale them up.
What are some of the things that the roadmap is going to address? What are some of the places that you're seeing the most need for change and acceleration?
I think Lewis can certainly answer some of the options when it comes to clean energy and more responsible energy at the mill level. But for us at the fiber level, it's going to be a direction of travel for recycled circularity solutions, and certainly the road to regenerative elimination of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and different things like that. So it will be accelerating change and like what we know are proven solutions. And so it'll be that direction of travel of circularity and regenerative are the key words.
So Lewis, can you address some of those potential innovation gaps at the level at which you're working?
Sure. Yeah. And I think that to kind of continue in Lorraine's discussion there, that as we're looking at the different areas in which we can impact water, energy, chemistry, and materials and material impact on that, there's a lot of overlap between these targets. And so as the industry is establishing a target for climate, deeply the correlation to water, and as we're looking at these different industry targets, it's important that we also think about how do we drive towards those specific end goals. So like, as you brought up with this roadmap that we've been working on with World Resource Institute, that's going to be coming out this fall, is really identifying sort of the 6 key areas in which this efficiency work needs to happen. Lorraine spoke to the first 3: maximizing material efficiency, scaling preferred materials, accelerating the next generation of materials. That's where we can tee over to Brittany and Fashion for Good, like really identifying those disruptions and new material innovations. And then in the world that we're working on is really around as you mentioned, what we call scope 3, which is the supply chain, and looking at all the way from raw materials to finished product assembly. We need to maximize energy efficiency. And that is not always the sexiest thing to go chase after, the efficiency work, but it is a big lift that will have a big reward for lowering carbon in particular and saving water. Then we need to shift to 100% renewable energy. We know that. So then the gaps are, how do you do that in a specific function of production in a specific region with its own unique set of issues, right? And then eliminating coal is part of that, so the part of the process of eliminating coal is, well, we need to get the boilers hot enough. What are we going to use? So then the gap is, it's not going to be the same thing everywhere. And there's also a need for disruption. So we can burn other things that are lower carbon and don't have as negative of an impact, or we can disrupt it and find something to disrupt the whole boiler system. And that's where we would look over to our friends at Fashion for Good and say, hey, what are we seeing around disruption? Can we bring that into scale? So I think you're asking kind of like what we're working on and where those gaps are in the supply chain. There's a lot we can already do and we know to do, and there is some existing areas to disrupt, and I'd love to do a whole panel on that. That would be fun.
We should definitely do that. I want to go back to something that I talked about in the very beginning, and I think, Lewis, you really just hit on it. Fashion is the Trojan horse. There is not an industry on the planet that does not need to address the issues that you're talking about. Getting boilers hot enough for industrial processes, getting off of coal, getting into 100% renewable. We can't have just the fashion industry doing that. That won't make enough of a dent, though we're big problem makers. Just us cleaning up our act is not enough. It's one of the interesting things for me about SustainChain, and I know I keep talking about it, but it's kind of my baby. But SustainChain, I want to be really clear to everybody who is watching, is not just for the fashion industry. It is across many different disciplines. So it's interesting to me, as I'm going to go to Brittany, to talk about some of these innovations and how we scale them, kind of flipping off of what Lewis has said, that maybe there is a way in which these innovations can cross boundaries between, that we can kind of de-silo innovation.
Yeah, so I mean, kind of one of our probably worst kept secrets is we often look at innovation in other industries and try to pull them into the fashion space. So if you think about the automobile industry, they're a massive consumer of leather and fabrics for interiors of cars, or even finishes on dashboards. And we try to take those innovators and those startups and convince them why they should come work in the fashion space. So, quite a few things. I think we talked, we kind of hinted at it earlier of the report that we did with BCG at the World Economic Forum last year. And that identified the gap in financing with a, $20 to $30 billion opportunity, predominantly at the beginning and the end of the supply chain. So in that raw material space, you know, we have 115 innovators. So picking a few is like, you know, asking to pick your favorite child. But, you know, one that comes to mind is natural fiber welding. So they use a patented processing technique to produce plant-based textiles, similar to conventional cotton, or even a leather-like material that doesn't use plastic. And they recently raised 13 million in partnership with Ralph Lauren. So there's someone that's found this kind of more science-based raw material innovation, and they found a partner within the industry to really help them grow. If you look kind of a bit further along in the supply chain, a circular business model, we have Trove. So that's a business-to-business solution. It's a software. It's a bit more than a software, of course, but what they do is it allows businesses to plug in and start a resale business, because, you know, brands are missing a huge opportunity to capture that secondary market. And they recently raised, I want to say 35 million, I think is their total funding. And they've partnered with Patagonia and Nordstrom. So again, the importance of not just the financing coming in, but the partnerships from the brands, and then deeper in the supply chain to kind of signal to those financiers as well. You know, there are many more. You can find a bunch on our website. And if we want to go into specific topics, we can later.
That's really exciting. One of the things, and it actually keeps coming up in the chat, and I think is really interesting, and a topic I know all five of us are passionate about, is what happens to these things afterward. I was about to ask you guys a question about what are consumers' roles, but this is really a question about waste. And waste I'm going to ask you about waste at every end of the supply chain. We're getting asked about end of life, but let's talk about, you know, there is waste created at the fiber level, at the mill level. There's waste created, you know, before things go to market, after things are at market, and by the consumer. What can we do around waste? Louis, you want to talk about this first?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I want to, one thing that I want to interject too is I think sometimes we use the word fashion, and we can also disconnect from an audience we're trying to reach. And I just think about how I had a conversation this last week with a family member who was saying, "Oh, it's great you're doing that work in fashion, but I don't really relate to, you know, luxury and runways and Vogue and all this stuff. That's not really important. You know, focus on something more important, Louis." And I said, well, wait a minute. You're talking about the global apparel, footwear, and accessories. You have 2 kids, right? Look at all the clothes that we have there, you know, and you're an outdoor, you're, you know, engaging in outdoor activities, camping, mountain biking, et cetera. You're purchasing a lot of equipment, apparel, textiles from these industries. So I sometimes think it's important that we also share with our audience that this is one of the largest industries that reaches into the chemical industry, that reaches into farms, that reaches into worker livelihood for women globally, one of the largest employers globally. So I felt the need to also kind of bring that in for some relevance, but let's talk about waste.
But we can also talk about that as, you know,
yeah.
Sometimes we refer to the fashion industry because it's sexy.
Yeah.
Really what we are in is a textile industry.
We're all wearing it, right?
We're all wearing it, but like if I look at your background, like, you know, you've upholstered those chairs in something, that rug is made out of something.
Absolutely.
So it really,
absolutely.
When you start thinking about it from a textile perspective, you can't be anywhere without being like, it's there, it's there, it's there. So.
Right. And it's home textiles, and it's bedding, and it's hospitality industry and all that. And so, and I think it's important because we're talking about 7, 8, 9 billion people on the planet that are engaging, need to be clothed, need to engage in home textiles in some way. What does that look like? And that tees up the waste. So I want to hear from other members of the panel on this for sure, but you know that I ran the Cradle to Cradle Products Innovation Institute prior to this. So I've been very focused on circular economy and how we address the issue of waste. And I think all of us are positioned to look at when we talk about efficiency, also it's about efficiency of materials throughout the supply chain too. And you brought up a great point, which is that it's not just about post-consumer collection and putting it back into future streams. That is a big part of it. That's something that Fashion for Good's working on. It's a really important part of it, but it's also around dead stock. It's around efficiency of ordering. There's so much around the whole structure of retail and sales, how many sales we're pushing, and a culture that also creates the production and the discarding. Very much mirrors the agricultural industry in terms of what gets grown and actually makes it into your kitchen, and you know, is what gets produced and actually makes it into your closet. And then once it's in your closet, you're only wearing 25 to 30% of it anyway. So I think you're absolutely right on the issue there. And new business models are going to be a big part of this too, and how we engage in the relationship. So the elephant in the room is always production and consumption. And we all are very pro industry because we are working with and support, and we recognize the positive benefits of it, but we also have to look at the responsibility of industry to continue a growth model that's based on producing a linear waste model, and then it ends up in landfill. So I'll stop so others can talk on this topic, because again, I could go on this for a while too.
Amina, do you want to talk about how you're tackling that from your side, from the SAC side?
Yeah, I mean, I want to maybe tackle two topics here because it came up in the chat, both on the waste and on the consumer piece of it, because I think they're really important. You know, on the waste piece of it, you know, many of our tools, and Lewis mentioned this, it's really also about efficiency across the entire value chain, right? So it's not just waste at one point of the value chain, but really looking at, okay, at every single point, from materials through production, through consumer use and end of life, is how do you measure that, and how do you measure the waste across that entire value chain? So with the HIG tools, that's a lot of what we're doing, right? It looks at materials, it looks at production, it looks at from a brand retail perspective, you know, what are they doing and what are they implementing in terms of the materials that they use, the products that they make, and whether they're designed for longevity. You know, all of that is incredibly important, and it does have to be taken as a step-by-step approach, right? And I think you mentioned this, which is really looking at it across the entire value chain. So that's number one. The tools do that, and they help companies to understand that, where they can drive greater efficiencies and where they can start to not only reduce waste, but even design materials or their products differently to account for that. That's number one. And then the second piece is around consumer engagement, because this is incredibly important. And when the SAC started, the end goal for these tools was not just that these tools were going to be business, you know, B2B, but that ultimately the outputs of this information, the outputs of this data, were going to be consumer facing. Because if we are really going to try to address, as Lewis mentioned, this market that everyone is wearing clothes, everyone out there is a consumer, that you really need to be able to engage consumers, and you need to be able to educate them with credible data that helps them make more informed purchasing decisions. And that is incredibly important. And so the output of the tools for us is really about, how do you put all of this information into the hands of consumers so they can make decisions about what they're purchasing, whether it is, you know, whether they're looking for materials that are recycled, whether they're looking for materials that have a lower carbon impact or lower water usage. It's so important to be able to translate this data and then ultimately put it in the hands of consumers, because they are the ones that are going to be driving a lot of this change across the industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the role of consumers, and I don't even know if we have time to get into the role of government, but the role of consumers, I think, being informed consumers. So the way that you're talking about with the HIG index, I had it described to me once as, you know, in the 80s, we didn't have nutritional information on cereal boxes, right? We had, you know, frosted mini wheats. You knew there was frosting and wheat, but you didn't know what else was in there. And so when we got nutritional information on there, people started to be able to look at those things, understand those things, and then be able to make better decisions for their health. Now, obviously, we need to get to it. We need to do this really quickly. We can't, you know, but I also, you know, we keep getting more and more questions in the chat, and I want to address them about the US, especially apparel and textile waste. And maybe this is a place to talk about, is there a government role? Is it a consumer role? Who is going to, how do we bridge this gap between all the stuff that we have, and then how we get it into some of these exciting innovations? Brittany, maybe you can talk about it. I know Fashion for Good has quite a few textile innovations that are depending on those gaps.
Yeah, so I think the stat that we often referred to is 73% of clothing produced is sent to landfills or incinerated. And that's of all the new clothing made, and less than 1% of material used comes from recycled sources. So, those are a bit of shocking numbers that show that there's a lot of progress that is yet to be made. But an example of what we're doing in this space, and we're trying something different, we're trying a kind of orchestration or a consortium model approach with our Full Circle Textile project, which just launched last Thursday. And what that is pulling together the various players that have a role in all of that, and the innovators. So Stacy from Evernew is one of the innovators. And we're only able to do this because of the years of work that was previously done by a lot of the folks on this panel here today with me. So I think it's a bit like running a relay race. And given an industry is incredibly complex and nuanced, it takes approaches and interventions from all different angles to really drive the change. So it's nice to have complementary and additive work, and especially from the textile chemical recycling side. It's early days, and not to say that there hasn't been years of work behind that, but there's a lot of promising innovations. They just need the support and the structure around them that we're trying to set up to really catalyze them forward.
I do want to address with Lorraine, can you talk about maybe the role that policy needs to play in this? Because the work that the Textile Exchange does sort of like butts right up against that policy shift place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and talking about recycling is a perfect example of what needs to lead into some policy and advocacy work. So it's really interesting to think about what levels of policy. For example, when you think about the recycling that needs to happen, when do we start pulling things out of landfills and they go to composting if they're biodegradable materials? What happens? There's going to have to be regional solutions. So you're going to have to work with like the Lander, Wyoming, waste facilities in order to make sure that the infrastructure's there. Europe is way ahead of us, and as far as collection points, not only for glass bottles and cardboard and those things already, but also for clothing. And so you're going to have advocacy and policy work that needs to happen at a local level. It's going to happen at, those regional hubs. And so there's going to have to be those regional, places to process and pull things out. Like you say, chemical recycling is certainly an option, but right now it's very hard to do a mixed fiber. It really needs to be 100% cotton or 100% polyester, which reminds me of some work we're doing on the West Coast in regards to home and hospitality. Because when you look at sheets and you look at towels and things like that, they're usually 100% cotton, and you can take those straight into a recycling facility that can go into a mechanical processing piece. And the same thing with all the tablecloths that are used in the hotels in the event and hospitality industry. So there's a lot of piloting work that's going on, but it's going to be layers of solutions that create the infrastructure that's needed for more aggressive recycling and taking it into a circular solution. And so it's going to have to happen regionally, by state, by nation, and be able to work across those things. And a lot of investment will need to be made for the infrastructure at every stage. And so, yeah, it will be important to not only invest in the infrastructure for a market-driven solution, but to have the support from policymakers to set up the requirements to say, this is what we're going to do with these types of products.
Thank you, Lorraine. I think that's such an important point. And now you've got me thinking about how we need to get those government policymakers into SustainChain. Paul Pullman said on Wednesday on his panel that we should be focused on aggregating these coalitions of those who are willing to drive these tipping points, which I think this group is like the manifestation of that kind of leadership, right? I mean, you guys you all have your own organizations. You are not one organization, and you came together to do more together and to accelerate things by working together. So as my last question for you guys, and I could talk to you all day, knowing what you know, what would you suggest to other organizations? Are there shortcuts or guidance or best practices that have helped you guys achieve in this way, working together and moving forward quickly? Sorry, Brittany, do you want?
Yeah. Yes, I do. I want to jump on this question because I think it's so important. And you know, Lorraine referenced this earlier, and so did Lewis as we were talking about it. But there is so much good work that is already out there. And I will say that the first thing, and I think all of us on this call agree, the first thing to do is to actually take a look at what is already out there and how we scale the best tools, the best resources. It's part of the reason why our organizations have gotten together, is to really try to reduce the duplication of effort that exists within our industry, and to really start to mobilize action and accelerate that action in a very unified way that is complementary, right? We do have our own organizations, but there are real synergies between our work, and that is what is going to allow us to kind of catalyze this action and really drive exponential impact across the industry. But it really starts with folks looking at what is already out there and not reinventing the wheel, because at this point we don't need to. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. I agree, and Brittany mentioned this, you know, there are gaps from an innovation standpoint that we do need to fill, but I really think it's about leveraging what already exists, making sure that we're scaling those tools and resources as much as we possibly can, and then filling in the gaps with what is missing to really drive collective action at scale.
Brittany, do you want to take a stab at this one too?
Yeah, I think, and probably a thread I've been saying the whole time is my biggest advice, or kind of words of wisdom, if you will, is you have to think of, to get anything done, you kind of have to think of working through a constellation approach. So there's no silver bullet, there's no immediate answer to any of this. What you need is consumers that drive the demand, right, through increased awareness and changing consumer preferences. You need the manufacturers and those further up the supply chain to adopt new solutions. And to be able to do that, they need to be exposed to them and also given favorable financing to make it a case. And you also need funders to make it all possible. So I think my biggest piece of advice is think of it holistically, and think of how the more people you bring to the table, the more support can be garnered to actually move things forward.
Awesome. Lewis or Lorraine, do you guys want to take that one? Lorraine?
Sure. It's so interesting to listen to this piece of it, because ultimately we've got to make a paradigm shift. The underlying, you know, just what Brittany shared, there's change that needs to happen here, and change that needs to happen here, and advocacy that needs to happen here. But what we've got to really realize is that business as usual is no longer acceptable. The current business setting has created the pollution and the poverty and the problems. So we're really looking at a paradigm shift in, you know, from price only and the cheapest product, and I can have more t-shirts and tennis shoes, into really buying value. So a price to value paradigm shift of what I'm wearing is actually healthy for the planet and healthy for the people who made it. And I'm wearing my values and sleeping on my values and living and loving in my values because of the choices I've made on the materials that I'm wearing. And so that goes back to consumer engagement and education. We're seeing brands that are talking to their consumers having exponential growth over the brands and retailers that they're not talking to their consumers. We've got a lot of brands that may have a yoga line or a baby line out of responsible materials, and that's maybe 1% to 2% of their business. They know what solutions they need to do, and it's time to go from token programs to full-scale corporate solutions and strategies for these companies and brands. And so, speaking as a cotton farmer, I cannot grow it on a maybe. To invest in the changes I need to make in my field means I have to have a market-driven solution and a market partner in order to make it happen. So I think connecting all those dots and creating the value, price to value shift is something that has to happen along the entire supply network.
I love what you're saying, Lorraine. Lewis, how about you as our bookend there? Do you have advice for?
Yeah. Well, I'm also monitoring a lot of the questions, and I think that what's really important that's coming up is access. You know, that we sit in our little group and know what's happening and what's going on, and we have programs, and we're like, hey, send us an email, we can maybe connect you. But we need a system, right, or a platform to bring together more and more people globally. We do that within the tools of the SIC, and I think that's really important. But I think ultimately, how do you find How do individuals find us? How do we find them? How do we bring them into the existing tools? How do we bring them into existing programs and pilots? How do we bring financial resources? Because there's a lot of demand too. And I think this is one of the big issues I think that is we need to solve for, is how do we find these wonderful people that are commenting in here, hey, I'm in a country that would like this and I don't think there's very much going on. How do we respond to that to bring them into this work?
Amazing. I can't believe we're out of time. I could go another hour with you guys, but I want to thank all of you so much for not only showing up today, but for the incredible work that you are all doing. On behalf of the U.S. Coalition for Sustainability, I would like to thank our panelists, our fearless leader, Jacqueline Corbelli, our inspiring champion, Amina Mohammed, and the Blue Chip Foundation for making the last 3 days possible. If you missed either of the other talks, they are on YouTube. If you look them, you can look them up under SustainChain. And I also want to encourage everybody to go to I'd like to encourage everyone to go to SustainChain2030.com. It is, as I mentioned, not just a platform for fashion, and whatever industry you are in, the platform can connect you to your counterparts, and we can help accelerate this progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. As Amina Mohammed said, we all need to move forward together, and we need to do it quickly. All of these talks this week have been really enlightening. I encourage you to watch and share on YouTube. Thank you all for coming.